Okay, it's time. At long last, we are finishing this story. And I cannot wait to see how this ends. I expect this to be about an hour and a half in terms of reading time. And I am so looking forward to showing this to the author and hope that they enjoy the reading as much as I did. Maybe a little bit less than an hour and a half. Okay. Calliope's Tale by Falcom Reynolds. Chapter 15. Calliope Sees Vengeance. The captain forbade her from going, all of them in Dianthe. 5 different people told her she was not allowed to try and take on alizarin on her own. She didn't care. He had hurt Ianthe before, and he had almost made her kill herself to save everyone else. And he'd destroyed hundreds of lives in his fight from Baruni Hacker and in the battle earlier. She wouldn't put up with his existence any longer. As the moon, a thick gibbous, nearly full. God damn it, Bart. Bart, I'm trying to read. Bart. Okay, we got a cat. I hope that he's not too loud. Where was I? As the moon, a thick... Okay, now you're actually too loud. I normally love having you on my lap during streams, but now I actually care about audio quality. Oh, hold up. Let me deal with this cat. Oh, you big boy. Okay. This is my life now. I have a cat. I picked him up, tried to get him off my lap, and then he immediately hopped back on. So he is comfortable here. So I hope no one minds the addition of a cat for a story night stream. We will see. As long as he's not too close to the mic, he should be fine. All right. Anyway, where was I? No, you're actually too close to the mic. Oh my god. This cat. You know what? Screw it. Cat stream. So this is Bart. Look at this boy. Look at him go. Look at those ears. And how warm they are. He's here for the story too. Oh jeez, there's a bunch of birds outside. Those are some fat sparrows. Okay. Where was I? All right. Let's continue. As the moon, a thick gibbous, not nearly full. Oh, no. A thick gibbous, nearly full, rose over the sea. Calliope slipped back into the waters and slowed her heartbeat and breath. She did not want to be seen or noticed until she absolutely had to be. Denzel and Kiara had been right. Eliminate Alizarin and his fleet would fall apart. They were smart to go right for him. They had done it too obviously, and been unaware of his ambush. They had not had the upper hand like they'd thought. Alone, she could see everything. Alone, no one expected her. Alone, she didn't have to hold back. She dove. She knew where Alizarin's fleet was. They didn't see her, deep as she was, and she bypassed every other ship in the fleet and came at the heretic directly from below, slow and steady. The spirits swarming around it didn't notice her. Not when she carefully hummed a shimmer into the water to keep her presence a secret. And, ever so carefully, she drifted up to the ship and placed her hand on the keel. She felt the ship breathing, and she felt the spirits trapped in the wood, in the masts and rope, in the sails. She could feel it all. Time to destroy it. She had air. She opened her mouth and sang the same note as before, but this time she sang it with all the force she could muster, as loud as she possibly could, and the water around her heated up. She could feel the echoes of her own note reverberating back to her, and she flinched to hear them, but she kept going. The iron and steel in the heretic's hull, though protected by spirits, was not prepared for her. Just like before, she watched it flash heat to brilliant glowing white and sent out a Just like before, she watched it flash heat to brilliant glowing white and send out a burst of steam and stretch and lose shape, allowing the planks to move. Not the entire ship, certainly not. She couldn't manage that while in the water like this. But where she was, and that was enough. And perhaps her voice would reach further than she hoped. Some of the planks began to drift away, but she felt movement on the ship now, panicked feet and running. They knew something was happening. Likely they knew she was here. She ripped at the ship and was rewarded as she felt the planks come away under her hand, watched water swirl into the hold and precious air bubble out. She laughed. Perhaps it would be this easy after all. She opened her mouth again and sang a more complex sequence of notes, and this time she felt the heat above the surface break out as fire sprang up on the hull and began to race across the wood, clinging to the wood. The shouting grew louder, and she heard several splashes as a few pirates abandoned the ship. So quick to flee, she mused, still grinning. How hilarious! How strong they were earlier, and how weak they were now. Turning, she rolled in place and slammed her tail into the ship. Once, twice, 3 times, and she felt the ribs of the ship crack under the impact. Even with her size and the water's resistance, she still had enough force to do that. She reached into the hold and ripped one of the ribs out, tossing it into the water. The ship began to pitch and take on water, and Calliope laughed again, tearing at another board. There was a bang from above, and she watched dispassionately as someone fired a gun into the water. What were they thinking? Bullets didn't penetrate the sea very well. She watched the metal sphere go drifting past her and reached up and into the ship, pulling at the hold ceiling, forcing water onto the next deck. The heretic pitched more violently and screamed as she began to slip under the surface. The other ships were closing in, but she didn't care. The heretic was sinking. Now, where was Alizarin? Trapped in his own ship, unable to escape. Already in the water. She looked around for him, searching for that red coat, for that figure, for that disgusting sense, for whoever was controlling the dead ships. The heretic was going down. She watched the deck submerge and the sail become drenched. There he was, still in that stupid red coat, holding desperately on to the wooden rail. He looked up, saw her, and narrowed his eyes. And the heretic stopped sinking. Slowly, she halted, then began to rise upwards. Calliope stared first in confusion, Then in horror, as she realized, if she killed the ship, it fell under Alizarin's jurisdiction. He could bring it back. Alizarin's triumphant grin spurred her into action. She hated him, hated his horrible smile, hated his gloating words. With a flick of her tail, Calliope darted forward onto the deck and planted herself on it. And as the heretic rose above the surface again, water streaming from the decks and portholes and the holes Calliope had knocked in the hull, and even now she could see anything attached. Yeah. And even now she could see anything attached by metal was only partially held together. But somehow, just like the dead ships, it was still alive, and she finally found herself face to face with Alizarin. "So," he said, and when he spoke, she could see the interior of his mouth filled with writhing tendrils of greenish-black flesh. They writhed and pressed against the insides of his cheeks, making them bulge outward. He didn't seem to notice. "You're Iante's little secret, are you?" "I'm not a secret anymore," Calliope said triumphantly. "I am—" She stopped. No. There was probably no point in giving Alizarin her name, and it had caused more trouble than she cared to collect. "I am here to kill you," she said instead. "Good luck with that," Alizarin laughed. One tendril slipped out in front of his teeth and curled over his lip. He tossed his head back and swallowed to pull it back into his mouth. "You can kill my ship, but I'll bring her back." "No, I'm here to kill you, not your ship." Calliope smiled, holding herself upright by sheer strength and force of will. There's a difference." "Again. I wish you the best of luck." "I won't need it." Calliope reached behind her and pulled out the harpoon gun. She aimed and fired. The shot went wide. She frowned, retracting the harpoon with a switch and a whirring sound, and tried again. As she fired, her hand jerked to the side, and the bolt whipped away and thunked into the wood of the now tilted ship's deck. "What?" "You can't hurt me," Alizarin taunted. Hissing, Calliope retracted the bolt, pulling herself towards it and towards Alizarin. He sidestepped, and she smacked into the side of the ship, sending it reeling so far over to the side she thought it would capsize again. Alizarin had to leap for the mast and hold on to avoid falling in the water. "That's right," Calliope called to him, grinning. "Come into my territory and let's see how well you do." "You're a real treasure," Alizarin sneered back. "Where did they find you?" "In the ocean. Are you an idiot?" The ship wrenched itself back upright with a scream of breaking wood, and Calliope found herself flung back across the deck. She skidded to a halt and caught herself against the stairs as Alizarin balanced himself carefully on the mast. The heretic began to pitch back to the other side, and she found herself nearly thrown off again. She searched for something to cling to and dug her claws into the stairs, snapping the boards entirely. "Iante really should have given herself up," Alizarin sighed, shaking his head. "It would have made killing the rest of you very, very easy. But you know what? Your soul will do just fine." "Too bad you won't get it." If she couldn't attack him, what could she do? The heretic began to stabilize again, and she dragged herself further onto the deck. "Not unless you can kill me." "I don't think that's going to be an issue." Calliope gritted her teeth. "I do," she panted, and hurled herself forward, shooting the harpoon gun again. It got closer to Alizarin, but still missed him. He laughed again. She couldn't attack him. She probably couldn't rip him apart with her hands, but she could just hold on to him? But could she just hold on to him? "What's so funny?" she asked, retracting the gun and getting closer. He stepped back, so small and quick and agile around her massive form. "It's just amusing, all this," he said. "You really think one single person is going to be able to stop me?
What could possibly give you that impression?
Overconfidence, Calliope replied, and leapt for him. He darted out of the way, and she hissed again and sheathed the harpoon gun.
That's also not going to work,
Alizarin said.
You can't attack me. You can't harm me. You physically cannot do it. I have ensured it.
Loopholes. Where was the loophole? There was always a loophole. Every agreement had its flaws. Every order had its blind spots. The more generic a command, the easier it was to subvert it. That's too bad.
Violence isn't the answer this time. Well, it isn't for you, anyway. It definitely is for me.
Alizarin went for a gun at his side, but when he tried to pull it out, it stuck. It had melted into a chunk of silvery slag and become glued to his clothing, and he glanced down at it and growled in frustration. Calliope grinned. Loopholes. There had to be something. If she couldn't act violently, maybe she could act non-violently, but in a manner that would still kill him. No, you're right. Violence sure isn't the way, she said. What if this was ridiculous? Oh, what if this was ridiculous, but so was her entire attempt at taking down Alizarin's fleet with nothing but her claws and a harpoon gun. It sure is dangerous to be on board a sinking ship, isn't it? I think I'm going to save your life.
Excuse me?
Calliope lunged at him again, and this time he didn't dodge fast enough, and she grabbed him in what was essentially a double-armed hug, crushing him close to her chest. He yelped as she did so, and she tumbled forwards and off the ship into the water.
You... what?
Alizarin managed, and then Calliope took a deep breath, filling her lungs with smoke-tinged air, and dove. Holding on to Alizarin was hard. He was wriggly and slippery, and she kept feeling her arms involuntarily start to lose him. But she made sure to be careful and to not hurt him. She didn't want to hurt him. She wasn't going to hurt him. She was just taking him away from the very dangerous on-fire sinking ship. To save his life, of course. To keep him safe from the ship that could explode or burn or break. He could get a splinter. How kind and thoughtful of her. Now, if in the process of saving him, she accidentally took him somewhere and he became fatally injured, well, that wasn't her fault now, was it? No, of course not. That heavily flawed reasoning was, apparently, enough to convince the spirits that Alizarin had bound. Perhaps they were only governed by the exact words he'd used to work his magic. Perhaps, even dead, they still hated him and wanted him to suffer for what he'd done to them. Whatever the truth, it was enough. Calliope dove straight down. The flaming wreckage of the heretic began to sink above, and Alizarin was trying to hold his breath, but growing more and more panicked as Calliope powered downwards, away from the moon and the stars and into the depths. If anything, the goddesses of the ocean would be pleased to have Alizarin delivered directly to Athu's grasp. Calliope kept her arms locked around Alizarin's form. Around her, she felt spirits swarm over her skin. They knew what she was now, and she felt as they took the form of sharp little claws and tore into her skin, ripped at her hair, sliced through her fins. She rolled to try and shake them off, but they kept going. She tried to swat them away, and to her surprise she almost could. To hurt her, they had to take a physical form. She saw Alizarin squeezing his eyes shut, but watched him twitch his fingers and felt the spirits tear deeper. They're going to ruin my tattoos, she thought, infuriated, and powered downwards harder. She couldn't hurt Alizarin, couldn't rip his hands away to prevent him from controlling his stolen spirits. She just had to keep going. Around her, shapes flitted through the water. She couldn't catch them in her sight, only out of the corner of her eyes. More spirits? More tricks? She faltered and felt Alizarin struggle, trying to get free. At the same time, she felt her limbs lock up, her tail freezing in place, keeping her from tightening her grasp on Alizarin. She felt him wriggle again and start to free himself. No, She hissed out a barely audible note and felt the spirits recoil from her for a second, and in that second she renewed her dive, surging into the black. The pressure increased. She saw Alizarin frantically flailing, trying to pull himself out of her arms, and held on just as carefully as before, taking the utmost caution not to hurt him. She cupped one hand around his head and held him close, as if she were protecting him. Alizarin's mouth was shut, but he was covering his ears and eyes now. She could feel his body shaking. He was a scrawny little thing, really. No strength in him at all. Not here. And his hands were occupied. The flickering images in her vision were gone, and the spirits that had been nipping at her body had vanished. Without his hands, he couldn't do anything to hurt her. She grinned fiercely as she felt her body adjusting to the weight of the water over her. Alizarin was out of his depth and into hers. She kept going. All light was gone. She could see, but only barely, and Alizarin certainly couldn't. He was struggling still, but as she watched the air in his lungs burst out from his mouth and spiral upwards in a trail of bubbles... Oh, okay. I'm gonna try that again. He was struggling still, but as she watched, the air in his lungs burst out from his mouth and spiraled upwards in a trail of bubbles. He reached out towards them, opening his eyes, unable to see but knowing where his air went, and the tendrils in his mouth spread outward and flailed, searching for air, anything at all. They unraveled into thin, slick lines that grasped at the water, stretching down to search past his neck to his torso, touching Calliope's skin once or twice. The feel of them was repulsive, like the faintest brush of a finger or fin, gentle, yet horrific. The temperature was dropping. She thought Denzel's magic was cold, but the deeper ocean here had her shaking, even through the layers of fat she'd grown from her steady diet of fish and whatever sea life she could get her hands on. The chill was seeping into her lungs, and she wondered how long she would be able to hold her breath. Even now, she felt the pressure pressing on her skull and ears, though her ears were protected by several layers of webbing when she went this deep. Alizarin finally went limp in her hands. She saw more than felt, really. She saw more felt, really felt. Oh, no, okay, let me try that again. She saw more felt, really felt. His body convulsed once, felt him break, watched blood drift out of his mouth and nose in faint crimson clouds. She couldn't hear his frantic heartbeat anymore. Good enough. She let go, dropping him into the blackness. It disappeared instantaneously. And then she began to panic. Which way was up? She was completely disoriented. She tried to catch sight of Alizarin's body drifting, but it was gone, and even if she spotted it, could be going in any direction. Were there currents to catch it down here? She didn't know. She swam forward, then turned, then regretted turning. It didn't feel right. None of it felt right. She couldn't figure out what was the pull of the ocean floor and what was the pressure of the water and what might have been the push of a deep-sea current on her body. There was no direction here. She was suspended eternally in an endless void. She didn't want to die. She didn't want to die. She thought of Ianthe, of her pirate family, of the goddesses. Their faces ran through her mind. Mikulo singing, Ianthe with her arms spread and the goddesses burning in her blood. The goddesses! Maybe if she prayed to one, she'd be saved. Kalari. Storms. Nope. Zikal. Life? Maybe. Zoriel. Stone? Perhaps. Athu. Athu! She closed her eyes for a moment. Athu, show me the way to the surface. The ocean was merciless. Alizarin's body drifted further, vanishing into the black. Calliope shivered and tried to keep her heartbeat down. It pounded in her ears. The darkness was all-consuming. She closed her eyes for a moment. Athu, guide me out from your everlasting depths. Vast, distant noises echoed from the far trenches, and the creatures that were miles away from her, low notes and distant scraping sounds, and the faintest echo of the underwater volcanoes rumbling. Calliope wrapped her arms around herself. Athu, please, I want to go home. And in the pitch darkness of the deep ocean. Miles of emptiness surrounding Calliope in every direction, in a world where the moon and stars could never reach and even the sun did not exist. There was light. A faint yellow luminescence in the shadows before her, in a single oval patch. It brightened, dimmed, and brightened again. And then another lit up next to it, and another, and a whole row of ovals of neon yellow color, growing brighter as she watched, and then smaller lines of circular dots running along the ridge of something. Was that up? Was that down? What was Arthur trying to tell her? She stared at it, baffled. Another line of yellow lights began to run through the darkness, and a few long, thin lines of light, and slowly Calliope realized what she was looking at. Above the seafloor, which lay not far below her, was a creature. She was larger than any undersea mountain Calliope had seen. Her black skin was craggy and ridged, sharp-edged plates of skin like scales mimicking rocks. Her tail lay on the seabed, half buried in the silt. Her tail lay on the seabed, half buried in the silt, and the luminescence she was giving off was glowing brighter and brighter as she woke up. She'd been asleep. The patches ran up her body to long, slice-like slits on her sides that puffed out water that glowed after it left her body. Gills, of a sort, and ahead of them 2 long, dark arms with strangely lengthened webbed hands. And above that, there was a thick, spiny neck, and a smooth, hairless head with long stalks that felt for disturbances in the water and were tipped with glowing bubbles. And then the eyes. She opened her eyes, and they were brilliant yellow, glowing enough to shine light on the seabed. Calliope saw small creatures scuttle out of the way of the light, hiding from the creature. After a moment, she opened her mouth just a sliver and sucked in water, and Calliope saw that the mouth stretched around most of her face and revealed rows of needle-like teeth in the light that glowed just inside. Calliope knew what this was, and she, was far more beautiful and far more terrifying than Calliope had ever thought she could be. This was a mer-matriarch, one of the eldest and strongest creatures that could ever exist, and she was staring at Calliope now. She wanted to speak to the creature, but she breathed air and couldn't risk losing it. And anyways, what would she say? Alizarin's corpse drifted downwards, a tiny dark splotch against the light. His coat floated in the water near Calliope while his body fell. She snatched the coat in one hand and watched the matriarch as she shifted her monochrome eyes from Calliope to Alizarin. She cocked her head to the side in interest, then reached out with one massive hand and carefully held him between 2 fingers. The wave her hand sent out nearly bowled Calliope over. He was dead, but the tendrils of his mouth still writhed around, grasping for air or something to hold on to. The light of the matriarch's eyes illuminated him enough to see the drainage that had been The light of the matriarch's eyes The light of the matriarch's eyes illuminated him enough to see the damage that had been done to his fragile human form. It wasn't pretty. The matriarch blinked, opened her mouth, and swallowed Alizarin's corpse whole. It vanished between her massive teeth. Calliope shuddered nervously, still holding the coat, as the matriarch looked up. She had no doubt that the matriarch would eat her given the chance, and that her gigantic body only looked slow and lethargic. The creature was probably swifter than a swordfish. But instead, the matriarch closed her eyes, then breathed out through the gills at her sides. Puffs of neon light spread over the ocean floor, curling luminescence produced by the matriarch that shone across more and more of the soft seabed, billowing clouds like smoke that glimmered against the mud. It took a few seconds for Calliope to understand. "Athu, thank you," she thought. She put her tail to the light and swam up. The matriarch's glow was powerful enough, and it was growing as she left. that she could see it for most of her swim up. It was so strong it only faded when she was left. It was so strong it only faded when she had left the midnight zone and could see a hint of the moon above her. And she slowed and stopped, astonished, because as she swam up, she passed the slowly sinking wrecks of Alizarin's stolen ships. They were returning to the seabed. She hoped the matriarch wouldn't mind too much. Othu was reclaiming what was hers. She kept going, but did not surface above the matriarch. Instead, she oriented herself by the stars and swam back towards the midnight sun and the collective fleet. When she finally broke the surface, she found herself crying massive, salty tears, shaking as she did so. Her lungs and torso ached from the strain of the changing pressure and the air that had been trapped inside them. She left herself floating in the water for a bit in the moonlight until she had control of herself once again. Then she wearily knocked on the sun's hull until someone woke up and came to see what was the issue. It was Sirio, rubbing at his eyes. "Let me up," Calliope said. "It's... Calliope, it's the dead of night," said Sirio, sounding exhausted. "I killed Alizarin and fed him to a matriarch," Calliope told him. "I'll wake Ayesha," Sirio replied. It took a few moments for the ship to wake up, but once it did, Calliope was hauled out of the water and immediately swarmed. She flopped onto the deck, causing the ship to list to the side a bit, and threw Alizarin's sodden coat down onto the planks. "He's dead," she said, resting her elbows on the wood and "He's dead," she said, resting her elbows on the wood and folding her hands over one another. "He won't be a problem anymore." The crowds of crew members parted, revealing Ianthe, who was up and walking, though unsteadily, with Mikulo close by. She looked down at the coat and up again, then swiftly stepped forwards and put her arms around Calliope's neck, burying her face in her shoulder. Calliope went slightly tense, startled. "Ianthe?" she asked, as quietly as she could. "For 15 years, I have lived in fear of one day meeting Alizarin and dying to him. I knew that even if I killed him, I would die in my attempt to do so. But you've saved me." "I mean, it's only fair," Calliope said with a shrug. "You all didn't leave me to die when I was little." "How did you do it?" She smiled, long and slow, sharp in the moonlight. "I took him somewhere he couldn't go." "I don't understand." "Humans," Calliope said carefully, still remembering the feeling of the water crushing her ribs, "can't go down very far. I can." Silence again, and this time Calliope could see the dawning horror and admiration on the faces of the crew around her. She let herself grin. Ianthe shook her head. "The ships he enslaved? Sank to the seabed? Oh, she really hoped the matriarch wouldn't mind. Oh, she really hoped the matriarch wouldn't be annoyed by that. Probably not. The souls? Free." Calliope upended the coat, and the fragments of glass fell sparkling to the planks. The remnants of the tiny bird cages Alizarin had kept with him. The souls within them were gone, their captor dead and their prisons shattered. "So these," Ianthe began, and then stopped, tilting her head to the side. Calliope could hear whispers in the breeze, but couldn't make out what they said. After a moment, Ianthe looked back to her. "I am told," Ianthe said slowly, "that you called upon Othu." No, I didn't channel her or anything, but I got lost. She woke up the matriarch. I was disoriented down in the deep, in the dark. The light showed me which direction to go. The matriarch, she breathed light." Calliope let out a breath, remembering the uncaring cold of the abyss, the deep squeezing of the pressure on her lungs, the weight of the ocean threatening to crush her head, her eyes, burst her ears. The matriarch had been one with the ocean, unbothered by the weight of the sea above her. Calliope shivered. Would she become that someday? Ianthe nodded. Thank you, she said quietly, and Calliope could tell the statement wasn't directed towards her. Ianthe's eyes were unfocused, staring beyond Calliope, beyond the ship, into the ocean. Thank you for bringing her back to me. To us, she added, glancing back to Makulo and the crew. For a second she hesitated, then said, You saved my daughter, and for that I owe you my life. Another moment passed. Ianthe listened, and finally looked down to the planks, smile bright on her face. She says that by killing Alizarin, you have already paid the debt for both of us. There was a moment of silence. Calliope pulled herself over and pressed herself against Ianthe. She felt the first mate laugh, breathless, and lean against her. After another moment, Makulo chuckled as well. What? Ianthe asked, glaring at him.
Not you, Makulo said, shaking his head. The other captains. They're absolutely going to lose their minds.
Calliope's Tale by Falcom Reynolds. Chapter 16. A New Day Rises. When the sun rose, the collective fleet was greeted by the sight of the few remaining enemy ships sailing quietly towards them, white flags up. Total, unconditional surrender. A serpent attacked, one of the enemy captains claimed, when the ships were boarded and their crews captured. His eyes were wild. They kept darting back and forth, frightened, searching for threats. It came up out of the sea and tore the heretic apart. It spit fire from its jaws like a dragon. We never should have doubted you, Ianthe said quietly to Calliope, while Makulo added sagely to the enemy. While Makulo nodded sagely to the enemy and tried to stifle his laughter. Don't worry, Calliope said brightly. It was fun. Fun? Revenge is fun. The collective fleet captain gathered on the board the midnight. The collective fleet captains gathered on the board the midnight sun with Calliope. Oh, yeah. I'm adding a word. The collective fleet captains gathered on board the midnight sun with Calliope. And you knew about this beforehand? Kiara demanded, glaring at Denzel. I did, yes. I did, yes. Why did you not use it before our battle? Hey, excuse me, Calliope snapped. I am not an it, and I don't answer to you. I only answer to the sun and the sea. Kiara subsided. She looked far less regal than she had before. The loss of her ship and crew had dealt a blow to her confidence, to her trust in herself. Calliope could see it. If it comforts you at all, Sun Yang said, I also did not know. Oh, I'm glad. Oh, I'm so glad. And Kiara, Denzel said, we did have Calliope. She destroyed Alizarin. But I know what you're really asking. You want to know why we didn't have her before. We wasted ships and lives attacking Alizarin and his dead ship fleet. Yes. We did not fully understand the threat. You said it yourself. We underestimated him. For that, I apologize, for it is partially my doing. Their deaths will weigh heavily upon me. Sun Yang took over. This is true, but additionally, Calliope could not have taken Alizarin and his ships on during the day, or during a battle. She needed the element of surprise. She needed the night. Calliope looked down, hiding her slight smile. Having the captains defend her like this felt nice. She was so used to hiding and eavesdropping. Hearing them openly speaking about her, to her, around her was different. She liked it. She liked being someone to them. To everyone. Kiara, arms folded and eyes dark under the puff of her hair, took a breath and opened her mouth to say something, then let the air out. I understand, she finally said. No, I understand, she finally said, lowering her gaze. I knew that it was likely we would lose some of our own in the battle. I suppose I just didn't expect my ship to be one of those that would be lost. I hesitate to view any ships as disposable, much like my crew, Denzel said carefully. A final dig and callback to the petrol scout, and this time Kiera understood. She glared at the planks. I will not do that again, she growled. Good. So, who amongst us will claim the bounty on Alizarin? Sun Yang broke in, glancing between them all. Calliope, of course, Denzel answered, almost surprised. He glanced over to her. I don't care about the reward, Calliope countered. Give it to Makulo and Ianthe. She was careful to list Makulo's name first. He was the ship's captain, after all. The only thing I want is to not be murdered in port so I don't have to hide underneath the ship anymore. Kiera nearly choked. You were in Baroni Hakir? I was there the whole time. She couldn't respond, shocked. Calliope grinned needles at her. I'm sure the sisters would grant you at least that, Denzel said, one eyebrow raised. It is the very least they can do, and you nearly single-handedly took down their greatest enemy yet. Well, let's go then. The Curse of the North and the Le Yuan de Weigong and the Midnight Sun sailed first and foremost with the sunrise into Baroni Hakir, and Calliope swam ahead of them at the surface of the water. Her proximity to the returning ships prevented anyone from firing on her. All here knew that the collective fleet had sailed out for. All here knew what the collective fleet had sailed out for, and that their return could only mean one thing. An assistant waited at the dock where the Midnight Sun came to anchor, watching the ship with disinterested black eyes underneath the fringed red scarf wrapped around her face and hair. Another stood while the Curse of the North let off a burst of steam and came to rest in the harbor. The Yuan docked to the Sun's port side. Makulo and Ianthe stepped down from the ship to greet the assistant, who simply nodded to them. Calliope propelled herself up out of the water enough to catch the edge of the dark plank deck and lean on it, face in her hands. We see the Queen's bounty has not returned, the assistant said, looking over the docked ships. Is her captain dead? No, Kiera called, striding down the gangplank. I'm here. Ah. They waited. The other captains joined them just off the docks, but close enough that Calliope could still be a part of the conversation. Your task is complete. Alizarin is dead, Denzel confirmed, bowing slightly. He wore his brocade vest and coat as always, this time with the addition of a pocket watch and darkwood cane with a silver cap. The sisters will be pleased. Who claims his bounty? I do, Calliope called from the water. The assistant regarded her with an expression of disinterested calculation. She seemed entirely unbothered by Calliope's presence and the fact that she was a Merid. It would be difficult to bring you to the palace for an audience, she mused after a moment. I'll say, Makulo muttered. I think that might not be possible. Sorry, Calliope said with a shrug. I mean, well, it's possible, but it wouldn't be pretty. Or anything but demeaning, actually. Can we avoid that? The assistant cocked her head to the side, and this time Calliope saw the gleam of amusement in her eyes. Very well, she said, nodding over to... Very well, she said, nodding ever so slightly. I will pronounce... Nope, that's the wrong word, Newt. I will announce to the sisters your presence. She bowed, turned, and left, striding away from the docks up through the shallow stone buildings and swaying palms of Baroni Hakir. The captains were left standing by the dock. Kiera glanced over the ships and ran a hand over her face. There were circles under her eyes that had not been there before, and a gash across her forehead and face had only just begun to heal. "As soon as this is over," she muttered, "I am going to have hell to pay." "Oh?" Sun Yang said, glancing over. "Did you think I owned the Queen's bounty?" Kiera asked, shaking her head and glowering at the sky. "No, I will have to pay for that, and it would take years." Sun Yang paused and glanced over at Iante. She raised an eyebrow, then turned to Kiera. You know," she said, "you could always abandon the crown." "Abandon the crown? I could never—" She stopped mid-sentence. "Consider your options," Sun Yang said soothingly, stepping up next to Iante. "You have no ship and no crew, but the two others who were saved by Calliope. If you return to the crown, you will have to work for them. If you return to the crown, you will have to work for them for many years to pay off the cost of the Queen's bounty. But there are several ships here that have been surrendered to Baruni Hakir for your sacrifice of your ship and your crew. Oh, for your sacrifice of your ship and your crew, the sisters may allow you to take one. But the crown wouldn't like that, would they?" "No," Kiera muttered. "They wouldn't." She drummed her fingers on her arm, then looked to the Peacebringer's assistant. "We do not care what you do," the assistant said, her face neutral. "But all are welcome in Baroni Hakir as long as you obey our rules." A long pause. She toed the cobblestones and looked out to the sea. "But Alizarin was right," she finally said. "He was right when he spoke to me. Not to the rest of you, but to me he was. He told me I was nothing but a soldier taking orders." The wind picked up, sweeping through the nearby palms and rippling over the cool blue-green bay waters. The sound of a market floated along it. The murmur of voices speaking over one another, the sound of animals calling in stalls, the chime of bells capturing the attention of passers-by. Calliope breathed in and smelled sweet Calliope breathed in and smelled sweet gulab jamun and the spicy marsala curry in the square, and rich baking fish and naan bread. Overhead, a pair of frigate birds circled, rising from somewhere among the vast swathes of green trees and foliage that ran like rivers through the city. They floated out towards the sea to sweep over the silver waves and snatch up the sardines that ventured too close to the brilliant surface. "He was right. But he won't be any more." Kiera looked back to the other captains and nodded. "I will take one of the surrendered ships. I'll take any of Alizarin's pirates who want to come with me." "A sound decision," Denzel said with a smile. "I can see you already. Scourge of the seas. He will be a fine pirate." "I'm disgusted," Kiera muttered. Iante rolled her eyes. "You can always go back," Sun Yang offered. No, I choose this course, and I'll stay to it," Kiera said, setting her brow in a frown. "And there are some interesting things I know about the crown routes that would come in handy were I to raid them." Already thinking like one of us, Captain Zidane," Makulo said cheerfully, grinning at her. "Good start. No, don't look at me like that. You can't really believe the crown sources all of its ridiculously expensive imported goods with any sort of fair deal, can you? Those are stolen. Go get them back." Kiera nodded, and a smile flashed across her face. "I think I shall, if the sisters give me the chance." They waited. The sun cast shadows over the land and out to the sea. The buildings began to give off heat in the rising morning. Calliope was glad she was in the water, in the cool waves. She could already see sweat. Oh, yeah. She could already see sweat beading on the faces of several of the captains and crew. After nearly an hour of angled sunlight and the sound of pelicans, Calliope caught the faint chiming of bells throughout the streets. She put her torso up on the dock again and waited, watching. It was a small procession of people, carefully making their way down the broad, shallow steps of the dockside. They were carrying a palanquin draped in red cloth, and as they drew closer, Calliope could smell the perfumes that billowed out from the curtains like smoke. The convoy set the palanquin down, and they... Is that how you say it? That's not how you say it, is it? Is it palanquin? Palanquin? How do you say that? Hold up. Google, help me.
Palanquin.
Oh, wow, that's way off. Hold up. There was a small procession of people, carefully making their way down the broad, shallow steps to the dockside. They were carrying a palanquin, draped in red cloth, and as they drew closer, Calliope could smell the perfumes that billowed out from the curtains like smoke. The convoy set the palanquin down as they stopped by the docks and waited. There was a moment of silence before the curtains parted, and Mahima Kurana stepped out. She looked around, almost carelessly, until she spotted the captains. Ianthe was the first to move. She stepped over and knelt, head down. "Peacebringer Mahima," she said quietly, eyes down. "This meeting is blessed." "It is indeed," Mahima replied, and looked to the captains. They followed Ianthe's example and knelt, bowing their heads. Calliope watched curiously as the second woman stepped out of the Calliope watched curiously as the second woman stepped out of the palanquin. This must be the second sister, Bamini. She looked over the captains quietly. "Rise," Mahima said, and that released the captains. They stood before the sisters. This made them nervous for some reason. Calliope could tell even Denzel had his hands clasped behind his back, trying to stop himself from fidgeting, from running his fingers over the silver head of his cane. The captains didn't like being on level ground with the sisters. The air of authority the sisters gave off was powerful enough that Calliope could understand why. It wasn't right to be on the same level as someone so great. For them, anyway. She didn't particularly care. "Elizarin is dead, then," Mahima said. "Yes, Peacebringer." "Why do you speak for the fleet?" Bamini asked. "Oh, why do you speak for the fleet?" Bamini asked instantly. "You are not a captain. You were not appointed leader of this endeavor." It was not the fleet that killed him, but my daughter, Calliope," Ianthe replied, flinching with the suddenness of the request. "Your daughter?" "Hello," Calliope called from the dock. "Interesting," said Shavi from directly next to her. Calliope jumped, startled enough that she splashed water up onto the dock. The third Karana sister had snuck so carefully up behind her that she didn't even notice her approach. She was now crouched at the edge of the boards, staring intently at Calliope. Hello," Calliope managed. "I'm Peacebringer Shavi," Shavi said with a faint smile. "You are Calliope." Yes?" Shavi's eyes were piercing. Calliope could see the energy deep in them as the Peacebringer looked over her, judging her in her entirety. "You killed Elizarin, then?" Shavi asked her. "Yes, I did." "How?" "I dragged him into the depths and fed him to a matriarch." It sounded dramatic. It still sounded dramatic, but somehow her words meant less in the presence of the Karana sisters. "Oh? He's dead. He's very gone." Shavi looked her over. "I believe you," she said. "So you're the secret crew member he wanted to know about. Iante told us about you." Calliope almost glared over at Iante, but the intensity of Shavi's stare held her in place. No, she wouldn't have been able to withhold information from the sisters either. Iante had done nothing wrong. "Yes, that's me. If you are in this port, you cannot be harmed by any other in this port. That is law. It applies to you." "Thank you," Calliope said. She glanced over at Iante, who gestured with her head ever so slightly. Thank you, Peacebringer Shavi." Shavi smiled at her. "The reward for Elizerin's death belongs to you," Mahima said, directing her attention to Calliope. The captain silently moved out of the way to give her a clear line of sight. "What would you do with it?" "Give it to Mikulo and Iante," Calliope replied instantly. She paused. "Oh, but Elizerin's fleet had several ships that surrendered to us after he died. Can Kiera have one of those?" Kiera looked stunned. The Mahima glanced over towards her and raised an eyebrow. "If you captured it," she said, "it is yours. Those laws we do not govern." Then just give it to the Midnight Sun and the other captains, I guess," Calliope said. "I mean, we all did a lot of work, so we should all get something for it. Just split it apart, I guess. Everybody did stuff, so everybody gets some. That seems fair." Denzel shook his head with a slight smile. "Astonishing," he murmured. The Corona sisters exchanged glances. "Very well," Bamini finally said. "We will work out what those rewards shall be. Is there anything else you require in the meantime?" "Not personally," Calliope managed. Bamini nodded sharply and turned away. Shavi sat down on the boards, bare feet tucked beneath her red silk dress. "A matriarch," she said. "You fed him to a matriarch." "Yes? How?" "She woke up when I pulled him to the seabed and consumed him, or what was left of him." Calliope shrugged. "She didn't eat me, obviously. I think I'm lucky for that. But she lit up the seabed and showed me how to get back to the surface." Shavi paused. Interesting. Whatever that meant. "She did you a favor, that matriarch. Perhaps someday you will meet again." "Maybe." Shavi tipped her head to the side, smiling. "It was lovely meeting you, Calliope, daughter of Iante. Return to this port whenever you see fit. I think soon enough nobody will be able to harm you, even if they are willing. They know what you can do. They know what you can be. They know what you might be. Swim far and deep." She stood and moved back to the other sisters, and Calliope watched her go. The majority of the captured ships were turned over to the Corona sisters, though their worth was paid to Calliope and the Midnight Sun, and by extension to the other captains. Kiera, where was I? Kiera claimed one of them and renamed it the Queen's Scourge, which Calliope personally found delightful. Despite her apparent, prior, distaste for pirates, she seemed to be very enthusiastic about becoming one. "You'll do well," Sun Yang told her, as she supervised the refitting of the ship to suit her desires. She'd taken on many of the pirates that had surrendered after Elizerin's defeat. "They'll listen to you." "They'd better." "They had better," Kiera said, raising her chin. "I'm not getting a bounty on my head by... I'm not getting a bounty put on my head by the crown to get ignored by my own crew." The captains met one last time, after the rewards had been given out. Mikulo shook Denzel's hand.
"Remind me never to battle you on the open sea," he said fervently.
I would never, Denzel said with a smile. I am far too fond of... I am far too fond of all of you to wish to sink your ship. Perhaps you can cooperate again in the future. Oh my God, I am making so many mistakes. I'm sorry. Perhaps we can cooperate again in the future. Kiara clicked her tongue against her teeth. I would certainly be interested in that, she said. After all, I am rather new to being one of you. Denzel rolled her eyes. Oh my God. Denzel rolled his eyes. Such a dramatic turn of phrase, he muttered. Captain Zidane, I will formally invite you to follow me northwards, so I may show you what I know of the area north of the equator, if you wish. There is plenty to be explored and understood there. I will accept that offer. And I will go south again, Sun Yang said, looking back to their ship. If you need my assistance, seek me out, and perhaps we can make a trade. I certainly will, Kiara said haltingly. Sun Yang nodded, then turned and strode away. Ianthe and Mikulo exchanged a glance. Where are we going? Calliope asked, looking between them. West, I suppose, Mikulo said. Towards the setting sun. You know there's another continent out... Wow. You know there's another continent over there, right? With cities and everything? Towards the setting sun and the parts of the world that no one knew. Calliope grinned. If any ship could make that journey, it was the midnight sun. What are we waiting for? It might be dangerous. Oh, please, Calliope said. Since when has that ever stopped us? Ianthe laughed. That's fair, she said. Then Mikulo glanced over at her, one eyebrow raised. It's true. Oh, it's true. We've never shied away from danger before. Let's find out what lies beyond the sunset. Calliope swept her tail back and forth. The tip of it brushed the lagoon's seabed, stirring up muddy river silt and sending a school of brightly colored minnows darting away. Don't worry, she said, grinning. If it gets too dangerous, I'll keep you safe. Thank you, Calliope, Ianthe said, rolling her eyes. I mean it! Calliope thumped the wood of the midnight sun with the palm of her big hand. I will, and I always will. A breeze scudded over the water, sending the blowing... Oh. Okay. A breeze scudded over the water, blowing Calliope's hair back, dripping wet as it was. She looked out towards the sea. Baroni Hakir was beautiful, but she longed to be alongside the sun as it cut through the swell, headed outwards across the vast blue expanse. She was no longer afraid of the open sea, of its immeasurable depths, of the blackness far below. She knew what was down there. The waters of the delta glittered around her. The sun was at its zenith, baking the mudflats dry and sending the seabirds away over the ocean to escape the rising heat. Let me try that again. The sun was at its zenith, baking the mudflats dry and sending the seabirds away over the ocean to escape the rising heat. Calliope flickered her tail again and felt it scrape against the sand below. West. Calliope smiled. Yes, she was excited for this. West. To find new things, see new sights, go to new places and meet new people. Taste new waters, fight new enemies, tackle new dangers. Calliope scraped her claws over the sun's hull in contemplation. New dangers, yes. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid of anything now, not since the matriarch had looked into her eyes. Besides, it didn't matter what dangers the Midnight Sun and her crew faced. Calliope was going to be there and defend them from anything that could ever hurt them. She was larger, stronger, and more deadly than most things in the sea now. She could take care of any trouble they found, and she would, no matter what. She would protect her family. My poor editor, indeed. Yeah. He usually gets through these pretty quickly. And I am paying him after all. Well, that reminds me, I need to pay him for the last batch. Whoops. There's one more chapter, though. We're not quite done. Calliope's Tale by Falcom Reynolds. Chapter 17. Epilogue. The sun was setting. Already. The sun was setting, brilliant rays of light lancing through the swell of the waves outside of Kanzaru. Calliope lay on the soft seabed, head and shoulders above the water because she was far too large to be submerged here. She looked at Ianthe and Mikulo. You know what happens next? Oh, you know what happens next? Ianthe called to her, looking down. Her thick black hair was now dusted with gray, and the wrinkles in her dark face had deepened. Calliope didn't like it, but she understood. I do, she said softly. If she were to speak without restraint, her voice would be too loud for most people to comfortably hear. But I don't want you to go.
We have to,
Mikulo told her, looking back towards the port.
We can't do this anymore.
They were leaving the midnight sun. They were too old. They were dying, unable to withstand the might of the sea any longer. Ianthe in particular. Her human form was taking the toll of years of channeling the goddesses. Her fingers were still scarred white from breaking Alizarin's fleet so long ago, and she'd accumulated dark markings from Athu's grasp and the old cuts and scrapes from Zoriel's stone and coral. When she spoke as Kalari, she still had lightning under her skin, but now it burned her, and every time she took a storm there was a danger that she would not wake up after letting it go. For her own life and safety, she had to leave the ship. Mikulo was similarly wounded. In a battle 2 years ago, he'd been shot several times, and had not fully recovered since then. When he was younger, he'd been the most agile and energetic pirate Calliope had ever seen. But now, he was often in too much pain to move with any speed or strength. He limped, and his thin frame lacked the strength to fight the way he had. It was safer for them to go. I know, Calliope said. She wished she was small enough to still hug them as she once had, and she feared their absence. If they were not her, she could not protect them. If they were not with her, she could not protect them. But she couldn't protect them from time anyway. Her own hair dripped down in the bay. Her own hair dripped down into the bay in waves of braids, each tied with a thick piece of tough rope, carefully done for her by the crew. A momentous effort that helped her see what she was doing on the surface or in the deep. Most Marids didn't reach her size without becoming matriarchs, so their hair wasn't usually an issue for them. Calliope remembered when she was small enough that Ianthe alone could braid her hair.
You know the crew would be lost without you,
Mikulo called to her with a faint smile. Without you, Calliope corrected. What will we do?
Find a new captain, someone you think is worthy, someone you'll protect.
I'll do my best. It was for the better, them going, and she knew that. She hated it, but she understood. Ianthe stared into one of Calliope's massive eyes. You'll keep them safe, won't you? Of course I will, Calliope replied with a snort. I will always protect my family. Ianthe nodded once, slowly, then looked to Mikulo. The two of them turned and walked away across the docks and disappeared into the port amongst the buildings. Calliope lowered her face and tried to ignore the deep ache in her heart. Someone appeared at the railing. Aisha, older but just as strong as before. Oh, Calliope, she called, looking down. Where are they? Calliope did not answer. They're gone, aren't they? They sailed into Baruni Hakir. Oh my god. They sailed into Baruni Hakir a week later, Calliope ahead of the ship. She had to stay off to the side of the bay, lying on the seabed. She felt a little bad for disrupting all the fish there, but they had business in Baruni Hakir. Xavi met them at the docks. She knew Calliope was coming. "You're looking for a captain," she said, eyes glinting. "Yes," Calliope said, and wondered for a bizarre moment if Xavi were about to volunteer. The Peacebringer smiled at her. "I will find you a candidate." "Thank you." The girl who showed up at the dock the next morning was slight but bold, with broad shoulders on a thin frame. Her eyes were deep brown, and her hair was as black as her skin, and coiled in a lumpy crown beneath a brightly colored cloth wrapped around her head. She pursed her thick lips and looked over the ship, then glanced over to Calliope, who was watching her from the water. "Is this yours?" she asked, casually. "In a way," Calliope replied. The girl looked back to the ship again and nodded slowly. "Peacebringer Xavi sent me," she said after a moment. "But I think you knew that." Calliope nodded. Of course Xavi had. Which means this was probably the best person who would captain this ship. "I'm Nenet," the new captain said, turning towards Calliope. She grinned. "Captain Nenet Ashraf. I would take your hand, but I think I might be a little bit too small." Her voice was low and scraped at the high registers she pushed it to. She wore a long coat that flared out to swirl around her knees. Calliope grinned at her, on purpose, displaying her teeth. She leaned on her elbows, a motion that sent waves sloshing up against the pier, and put her eyes very close to the new captain. Nenet stared back, unfazed. "Do you have a first mate in mind?" Calliope asked. "I'm certain there will be someone on board who would be willing to offer me advice," Nenet said. Another long, slow smile. "Very well," Calliope said. Nenet looked at the midnight sun, then back to Calliope, and sat down on the dock, dangling her feet meters above the water's surface. Calliope waited. "You know," Nenet said, after a moment, looking down to pick at a loose splinter of wood on the dock. "I heard stories about you when I was little." "Is that so?" "They said you could sink an entire fleet, and that you had skin tougher than dragon scales. They said you were dangerous, deadly, unstoppable." The sun beat down on Calliope's dark skin, shone on the inked kraken that curled over her shoulders and chest, and down her arms and torso and onto her tail. It had many tendrils curled and wound over her body, broken by some scars, crawling over others, a living record of her existence. "And?" "They were right," Nenet said, looking up. "How did they ever befriend you?" Calliope laughed. "They didn't know any better." That's some good stuff. I am looking forward to showing this to the author. Oh man, that took about as much time as I expected. Well, we will wrap up there for tonight. Oh, first longer story to be finished. So I guess next week we get back to Of Men and Dragons. and I try to do a little bit of catch up on some older stories. I hope everyone enjoyed that. I certainly did. I can cut back to just one chapter to fit it in with other stuff. I suppose I could. What chapter were we on? We were on chapter 27, right? Last we checked. Let me check. Calliope's Tale, Calliope's Tale, Up Men and Dragons. Chapter 29. Wow, we actually got further than I expected. Chapter 30, 31. Yeah. Good stuff. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up there. I hope everyone has enjoyed these. And tomorrow we should be continuing Table of Tales, which should be fun. Anyway. So thank you, of course, to my Patreon Thank you, of course, to my Patreon supporters: Tenace Games, Zebgrin, Slime Hunter, Walks with Gorillas, my dad, Gremlin Kev, Desalona, Miss Mango Plays, NBFF, Alpha Mango, Kawoke, Veritanium, Molly Copper, and Paper Dupless for continuing to support the stream. All of the support helps to pay my editor, who has been doing fantastic work going through these as he goes. I'm sure that he will, or he would appreciate something a little bit new, though. So I'm going to be trying to go towards something that may not be streamed in future. We will see. Also, thank you to my author supporters who allow me to read their content on stream. Dr. Blackjack21, Gas Station Jack, Galgamos, Mercury the Dealer, Slightly Assholic, Kaiser5243, Tendy Trucks 35. And until next time, I hope you all have a safe trip through the dark forest. I am going to send you all off. Who do I send everyone to? Let's do some Greedfall. All right. Well, I hope that's everything. Laters all.